talking about national museums and identity and belonging and things like that. But actually, as Peter said, it doesn't have to be a national museum. It's about every museum, every gallery, every heritage site, in a sense, that's part of a national pantheon, has a role to play in creating, supporting, developing a range of identities and senses of belonging. So please, when we come to the discussion, don't feel you have to limit your comments to things that relate specifically to national museums. So I'm going to start off by asking the panel first of all, and then we'll open it out to you. The first question, because of where we are today in Dublin, is about Ireland and its national museums. And the first question, in a sense, is coming from me as a Brit from outside. And I want to ask the question, what are the roles of the national museums in Ireland in contributing to Irish identity today, given the changes in society in the last 20 years? So I'm going to look.
Okay.
Yeah. Straight to you.
I suppose historically, and as Pat mentioned it in his discourse this morning in relation to the National Museum, effectively the national identity that is projected through the displays, in a sense, has come about by accumulation of deliberate effect and by accident. And I suppose the other thing is that you don't necessarily have to have collections to actually tackle this question, particularly for a national museum, as a museum that doesn't have a social history or a social history contemporary collecting policy. And I suppose the role would be to question, to get people to actually think about what Irish identity is today. And I give an example. We did an exhibition about 3-4 years ago in connection with this History of Ireland in 100 Objects, which is a rip-off of the Neil McGregor book. But the what we wanted to do was to involve the public, so we actually asked the public to choose the last couple of objects. So we had a short list of everything from Jean Butler's dress in Riverdance through Irish sporting prowess through Katie Taylor's boxing gloves. There was a hospital bed there talking about it, because at the time there was hospital waiting lists. You had a certificate of naturalisation representing the New Irish. And actually the two objects that actually came out tops were first of all the Anglo-Irish bank sign, which is in these bad banks, which is what caused the crash in the first place. And that was actually quite controversial, because some people actually didn't feel, some people first of all were worried about the security of the object in the museum, that people would sort of come in and sort of take pot shots at it. And then after the exhibition there was a question of displaying it on a long-term basis, and there were some people who actually questioned whether it was proper to actually display something like that in that museum. But the object that came out tops was a decommissioned AK-47 representing the peace process, which is interesting in its own right. Now, it was interesting. We had a public poll on this. We had an online poll, and we also had people who actually visited the museum. The online poll was the one where the AK-47 was coming out on tops, and one suspects that there was a certain constituency lobbying for a particular
or a lot of
aspect.
very young boys being very keen.
Well, there's that, yeah. Whereas there was obviously a Jean Butler's fan club at the very beginning who sort of sorted it off. So engaging with people can be good, but you can fix it, particularly if you do it as an online, as an online project. People who came into the museum bothered to come in and look at the material, and you got a different perspective there.
Okay, so
Can I mean, that's very interesting. I want to open it up to the rest of the panel, but I just want to ask you a follow-up question. So in that sense, I think that was a really great example of what museums can do. And I think it is about being controversial sometimes and getting people to think, because we may not all agree with the AK-47, but on the other hand, it does make you think, what else would I put in there? In terms of the collecting, though, is there any role that museums can play in contemporary collecting? Because I guess, and I understand now much more at the end of today than I did at the beginning, about the historical context in which much of the collecting took place and how difficult it has been for the national museums to display material which, in a sense, you don't have. But then, if we go back to year zero, which could be this year, what would we be doing in the future to develop collections that would be more representative of the society that we have in the 21st century?
Well, I think that's a particularly difficult question for a national museum, because you do have that collecting going on at local museum level. So you'd have most of the county museums and regional museums would be actively collecting in that area. The question is, in relation to a national museum, what is appropriate for a national museum to collect to, sort of, that wouldn't actually be duplicating what would be there locally. So I think the conversation we have to have, first of all, is with the profession, with the constituency out there, with the local museums, and it's one of the things that's in our famous strategic plan, to actually engage in that whole thinking of our collecting policy, and also in terms of our constituent parts, which are still the same departments that were existed since the late 19th century. But I think that is sort of that's a conversation we're going to have in the next year or two.
Okay, thank you. Right, so I'm now going to pass on to the rest of the panel, and I'm now looking in this direction. So the question is, you'll look at me like startled fawns. So what do you see as the roles of the National Museum in Ireland in contributing to this Irish sense of identity and belonging as society changes so very, very rapidly?
Okay. Part of what I was trying to, is that on? Yeah, part of what I was trying to get through in that kind of short narrative this morning was that museums are prone to inertia, the inertia of their accumulated objects. And if they're not constantly dynamic in the space of acquiring things according to, like, these are the elements of a language, the material elements of a material language is what collections are. So unless the language is evolving and changing like languages in the common way do, the museum won't have the language to address these relatively recent shifts in the zeitgeist, in the identity of their country. So that's where the National Museum has a challenge. What it needs to do here is unfreeze not only an imperial frame that was laid on it in the first instance and which still persists in the collection categories, it has then subsequently to unfreeze a very exclusive and homogenizing vision of what Irishness was, as represented largely through its archaeological and through its folklife collections. And that is a hugely challenging thing to do. And what that means, I suppose, in practical terms, apart from showing the good intent, which is the headlines in the strategic plan that says we will engage with diversity, it has to really start thinking in a very practical way. Well, how do you do that? How do you engage as a museum, as a place that speaks the language of material culture, with these changes in society? And it seems to me the only way you can do that is by committing to completely re-examining the way you look at your collections, the way your collections are configured, and indeed then trying to identify gaps that can be filled largely by, and this is the really great thing about it, because a lot of the really rich material is demotic. It's the things that immigrants bring to countries with them. It's the things that they treasure from where they came from. It's the Irish in Australia with their bags of crisps, you know, the Tato crisps, and the way home is summed up in certain kinds of objects. These are not difficult materials to acquire. And I would slightly disagree with Ryan on one point. I don't think that is something that can be left to local museums, because there's this qualitative difference. That the National Museum is looked to as a kind of realm of synthesis. Other museums don't quite have that expectation visited upon them by those who live within determinate national boundaries. That remains a challenge for national museums and is not going away. So they have to have, you know, this very dynamic relational sense of what's going on culturally within the borders of a given state, and that has to be reflected in their collecting and exhibiting activities.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else within the panel would like to comment on this before I hand it over to...
I would like to,
yes?
actually.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
I would like to respond to your question about the need for new materials. And that might be true, of course, but I think also that there is an amazing capacity to recode many things, many objects that are in the collection. And the most fantastic I know of is that every national collection, archaeological collection, have the first skeleton, the first people you found. And we found the earliest one in Sweden in 1939. It had an arrow, therefore it must be a man. So he started out as a man in 1939. He was very short, so he can't be Swedish. He comes from Sahara and needs to be a pygmy. So there was strange people coming early on. In 1943, they come to the conclusion that he was a she, and she was an example of the purest race in the world. And that was a success opening the National Historical Museum. Now you can come and visit the Historical Museum, and she will be presented explicitly as not Swedish, because they used the map to show that Sweden didn't exist. Swedes didn't exist. So what was she? She was a woman, she was an individual, and you can communicate with her. So and you can take object by object. It's possible to rephrase them. It doesn't mean that you don't need to have, but you can do quite a lot by sort of recoding this. That's one thing. And the other thing I would like to say is that even though we are focusing on the issues of identity today, and they are important, but I think they are important only as long as they help to enforce a live level of trust and creativity. These two components are important to be able to manage change, because the challenges to us are much greater actually even than the troubles in the past in Ireland, because we have the global change, we have demographic changes that are quite rapid, we have the climate change, an economy, a Europe that is sort of falling apart. So I mean the challenge that we need, where we need to contribute are huge, and I'm not at all sure that the focus on identity is really the way to go about it. I mean the risk is that it becomes to create a comfort zone where we can feel a little bit safe, a little bit at home, while everything is sort of falling apart around us. Sorry if that's a bit disrupting Friday afternoon.
I think one other thing is to ask your communities or your audiences what they would add to the collection. It's very nice to go back into a collection and re-examine it and reinterpret it. I think it's very important. But national museums of all types need to grow, and they need to grow with the help of external experts, but also community advisors. And I think museums also have to step back and realize that they may not be able to craft a strategy on their own. They may not know what to collect, and we shouldn't play God so much, although it's very tempting. We shouldn't always feel that we know the answer, and that if we sit carefully to ourselves, we could come up with a big theory. Ask more people. And sometimes the small stories, you talk about packages of Christmas, I mean, they tell a big story. Small things can, yeah.
Yeah, and I think these are great points, and I would like to also say that national museums in Ireland are facing the same problems as many other national museums throughout the world, and this is a big issue, not just in Europe, but in a whole range of other places, and I guess it's partly about museums being nimble and able to respond, and I know, having worked in museums, that isn't necessarily easy. So
9 of them, I think, who live in and around the Castlebar area, who have come from Europe, Asia and Africa, none from the Americas, as it happens. The objects in the exhibition are objects chosen by these women themselves to express what it means to them to be Nigerian, or from the Philippines, or Latvian, and the experience of migration, and now finding themselves in the rural west of Ireland. Could be the centre of Dublin, as much as it could be the west of Ireland, but it happens to be the west of Ireland. And we allowed them to express themselves. It's their voices. We juxtaposed two things. We juxtaposed the experience of young Irish female migrants to the United States at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and how they were helped, what drove them, what sent them across the seas, how they were received there and how they were helped there. We juxtaposed that with the experience of female migrants to Ireland at the end of the 20th the beginning of the 21st century. And while we didn't have much in the way of material from the collection that we could actually put against the earlier experience, the one item that we did use was the 100 teapot, which of course is one of the 100 objects. And that little exhibition, it's not a huge exhibition, it's a small enough exhibition, but it has opened up ways of expressing dialogue between, actually not just between the Irish and the foreigner, if I can put it as crudely as that, but between the foreigners themselves. How am I different from you? How is my experience similar to or different to your experience, whether I'm coming from South Asia or Eastern Europe? The Latvian woman, whose name unfortunately I can't recall at the moment, said, I'm Latvian. I'm a male woman, a proud male woman, but I'm not Irish. She was eschewing the identity of being Irish and holding on to her Latvian identity. And of course what made it sort of, I suppose, symbolically easy for her in some respects was the County Mayo GAA colours, the red and the green, Arak code in those colours are in the Latvian flag. So the objects that these women produced, and the one or two of them may come into the collection. Most of them are just on loan for the period of the exhibition. So it isn't a question necessarily of always having to acquire objects, but you can, through the immediacy of the object, create the narrative. We also allowed those women to speak in their own voices, to explain on film their experiences and what it was that meant so much to them. And it was mostly, again, through their mother's experiences and their own experiences. And it excludes, not by deliberate choice, but this is because it was the way it evolved. It isn't excluding the male experience or the larger family experience. It just so happened that it evolved because the participants happened to be all female.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I think you also raised a really key point, which I will just mention and I'll come back to you to front. The fact is that we tend to see things in binary, so we're talking about Irish or another nation and other groups, but actually people are so complicated that they may well be more interested in other groups and not in the majority, so-called majority national identity. So thank you very much. So I'll come to you first and then you, okay?
Thank you. I hope the question or the comment isn't going to be rambling, but I have a question a burning question that I want to ask, and it's about the National Museum, and not just the National Museum, but another institution here too. And it's why I cannot understand why we have a visible storage section, which contains a lot of artifacts from Asia, beautiful, from the Ottoman Empire as well. And we have a classical museum at Trinity that contains, I recently discovered, an Assyrian relief. And I'm trying to make a connection between our multicultural society that we have now, but not just that, also with my heritage as well, because I'm Irish, but I don't see myself as being represented in our national museums, because like many of us, I've lived abroad in other cultures, and I feel we're being deprived, in fact, of what is our heritage. And yes, I understand that period of time between our gaining independence and the what people were talking about was the I can't remember the exact word, but that period of sleep, I'd say. And my question is to do with why are we hiding away what I think would be of great interest both to our own people in terms of education and also to migrants to this country and people who, it's almost saying, well, we knew about you already, unfortunately not enough, but also I feel my nieces and nephews are being deprived with regard to education. And you know, Joyce and Wilde had the advantage of being able to go to, let's say, the National Gallery, where you did have representation with regard to art. And I'm just wondering, why is the National Museum, I know they have the Bender collection, but why are they hiding all those wonderful artefacts away? And isn't it time we took them out into the light?
Well,
That's my question.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's not a question of hiding anything, it's purely a question of resources. In the case of, for example, the visible storage, that was a gallery that was a store that had to be moved to make way for an exhibition, and rather than put the material in basements and cases or whatever, we developed a visible storage gallery, and that's the direction we would like to go on. We also have a new collections resource centre which is out in Swords in North County Dublin. We will be hoping that that will be open for tours. I mean, it'll have to be mediated. We're moving our collections there, our transport collections from various depots up and down the country. At the moment we're in the process of actually doing an inventory of our collections. So there's a lot of happening at the moment in terms of inventorising collections, moving collections, that sort of thing. I suppose what you're talking about in terms of the major displays, what you're looking at again is in relation to the Museum of Decorative Arts and History, which effectively there was a plan to build a central block there which would have a history, a gallery related to the history of Ireland, to the Earth Sciences of Ireland, and to the World Cultures galleries, which was, you know, the collections that haven't been on exhibition for many years.
Mm-hmm.
That was there ready, fully planned permission, and then 2007, 2008 came, and so the plans are still there. The question is whether the 65 to 75 million that would cost would become available. So there's no question of anything being hidden. It's a combination of happenstance and resources.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to move the conversation a little bit beyond the museum, one museum, and the word museum. In, let's say, in the States, all galleries are known as museums, so in Europe you have galleries and museums. However, what I want to talk about is the artist and the artwork. And I would like to sort of question the difference between when we display objects, which are very important in, let's say, museums, and exhibition making. Because I really do believe that, particularly in our country and at the moment, to have exhibition making must be a form that reflects the complexity of who we are. And sometimes it's far too literal. I mean, when you go into a museum and you see artifacts from, you know, different stages, different eras, and even down to migration and people coming back, that's interesting. But when you want to reflect on what's going on, you need exhibitions. And they have to have a complexity about them that isn't in a display. And that is what you need, and that's where the artists come in, and that's where the curators come in, and that's where the critique comes in. So I just wanted to ask you if that's...
Let me take this back, and I just want to ask the panel to comment on that, which is a very interesting comment. You
Well, yeah. Well, this is something that's been central to my own 25 years as a museum curator. I realised very early on in this hugely convicted space that to do the conventional museum thing, you know, the academically trained historian projecting authority through choices of display, was never going to work. And that for a start, you're always going to, you always need allies. New curatorship is always about, you need help. You have to start from the idea that you need help. And to me, at that time when the North was in its most explosive state before the 1990, the Good Friday Agreement, how are we going to interpret this place, this shrine of Irish nationalism, in a way that opened it up? And the only effective allies I felt I could reach out to were artists. And the first thing that came to mind was, exhibition is a visual mode. The great thing about artists is they're brilliant at the emotive, at the affective, and at the ambivalent. They can project ambivalent propositions about history and what it is to be human. And sometimes you can't do that just with the literal object from the collection that has a, you know, a kind of a totemic value to a particular tribal group or whatever it is. But when the artists interview us, they liberate it. They also come with this unspoken license from the rest of society, the artistic license, which is extraordinary, I discovered, which is that, you know, most of us in our bureaucratic roles, no matter how distinguished we are as academics, no matter how many books we've written, we do not have that license. And yet an artist who is respected and has some standing in society, when they come in and make these interventions, and sometimes they can be very forceful and very outspoken, they can go into spaces, they can look at emotional complexes that collections on their own can't. Now, the point is that it's the blend of the two, because when you're coming into this space, you're also seeing the original historic thing, but what you're being presented with in the round is a much more complex experience than you would if you were just simply looking at an historic collection.
The exhibition has to be complex.
Yes.
You can't just put on an exhibition of the works from your thing, or just a literal translation of them.
Yes.
Donald Maguire from the National Gallery of Ireland. This is kind of an extension from the point Barbara, I think, was making. And I'd like to go back to something Fionnuala said earlier on this morning, and I thought it was a very important point, that the Chester Beatty collection here is still seen as the other rather than as us. And it's something that I think is very interesting when I can't remember the exact figure, but you said something like 10% of the population today don't speak English at home, yet we still see this collection as something other than what we are as Irish people today. And I think it's an important point that I don't believe that objects necessarily exclude people. I think it's the narratives and the systems in which they're placed that exclude people. And it goes back to a point I think that was being mentioned there earlier, that objects can be recontextualized or thought of in terms of new contexts and systems and to engage other types of audiences. We don't necessarily have to, of course it's good to develop collections and expand them, but we can look towards the objects that we already have in the collection to find ways in which other types of audiences can engage with them and see something of themselves in them as well. And there's an exhibition which Barbara opened 2 nights ago up in the Hill End Gallery, in which Jessie Jones, an artist, has invited a group of women to select objects from the collection and to hang them in an entirely different context than the works have ever been seen before. Some of them haven't been seen in a long time. But it's repositioned them in a different type, a narrative that has allowed them to be read in a different way, or to be presented in a different way, and for an audience to engage with them in a different way. And I think it's been, even though it's only been open 2 days, I think it's been a huge success. I'm working on a project in the National Gallery at the moment looking at the visualization of the Irish diaspora, and it was something that we've been working on it for the last 1.5 years, about looking at artworks that represent Irish migrants. When we started, of course, there were a lot of images that were brought to us of people boarding ships and leaving Ireland. What we actually wanted to look at was how were Irish people represented when they were living abroad in the communities they entered. As it turned out, all of that art was part of the collections or the canons or the schools of other cultures and other nations. It wasn't normally thought of in terms of Irish art. We've been gathering hundreds of images from around the world that have never been thought of in an Irish context before. They're part of the schools of history of art of other countries. But there is an Irish story there, there's an immigrant story, an Irish diasporic story there. And to maybe add to what Pat Cooke was saying, we discussed how we might present this research project as an exhibition or something like that. And we decided the best way to do it was to invite a contemporary artist to do it, because, as you say, they have the license to work with things that are open-ended or unfinished, and to explore new ideas. And the artists, it's an exhibition. I encourage you all to come see it, as with the Jessie Jones project. We invited Sarah Pearce, who's a contemporary artist living in Ireland herself, a migrant of sorts. She was born in America and has been living here, settled here for the last 15 years or so. And she's created an installation around these paintings and repositioned them and recontextualized them in a way in which it doesn't present them as part of an American history or part of Canadian history, and not even so much as part of an Irish history, but part of a transnational type of identity. that and it's allowed. I've given lots of tours of the exhibition, and I've been surprised at how people who are not Irish have been able to engage with the show and see it's the concept that they're engaging with, that they're able to engage with because of the concept they're able to engage with an object that has literally nothing to do with Irish culture or even the culture that they may be from. But to go back to that point, I think it's not the objects that exclude people. It's the way in which curators and museums present the objects, and as part of museum collections.
Thank you very much. Right, I've got Kira at the back, and I'll come back to you.
Actually, this is a follow-up question to Donal. I saw your exhibition, and I was quite intrigued that it stays with the Irish diaspora. It didn't seem to reflect back to migration of what that might have meant, or diaspora communities in Ireland today from other cultures. And maybe that was a deliberate part of the exhibition. You didn't want it to go beyond the Irish in America or the Irish experience. But and it's the same. Sometimes you find with the online forums like the Irish Times, with this generation immigration of the Irish abroad. There's a huge opportunity there in exhibitions like at the National Gallery or these online forums where the experiences of what it means to be a migrant goes beyond the Irish experience of immigration over 600 years. And maybe that was a decision, you didn't want to look at that with the artist in your show, but I was looking for it and I didn't see it.
Yeah, will I wait for the microphone? There is a strong, I suppose, American focus. There are objects from throughout the world. When I say objects, I should say, before anyone's disappointed when they go to see it, the artwork in the exhibition is Sarah Pearce's artwork. There isn't any original historic objects. They're reproductions or photographs, I suppose, of the objects that we had taken. And they do come. There's objects from collections in South American countries, Mexico, African countries, Australian, Canada is represented in it, France, UK, and we of course we talked about the wider idea of migration and Irish migration also within a European context, and the fact that many Irish people left Europe to go to the New World for the same reasons that many Italians and Polish and Russians and Germans and Scandinavians left Europe, and under similar circumstances. Many Irish people didn't. The majority of Irish migrants didn't leave as famine victims, and rather than focusing on looking at why people have come to Ireland, we decided that the theme of migration is a universal theme, and diaspora is also a universal theme. We often think about Irish diaspora as an isolated phenomenon, when it's actually it's something that relates to diaspora universally and from many different countries, and often the Irish as diaspora are often represented and as part of a community that engages with other diaspora as well. It's not seen as a singular thing or an isolated group. And we felt that by focusing on the Irish experience, that as a universal experience, that any diaspora, that if we viewed it within this more in a more plural way, people would, from any cultural background or any ethnic background, could identify with it as well. And I think that's what I'd hope that's what we've succeeded in doing, without having to literally show people from other groups, because we're talking about in the Irish experience. We're talking about a population today that apparently is up to 70 million people. Also, we're talking about a history of 10 million people that have left Ireland. So even in the Irish context, it's incredibly complex. To talk about in the European context, you're talking about 70 to 100 million people, and then to look at globally, we're talking about a massive population of from history. So we decided to use the Irish example as a way to engage, to talk about a more global phenomenon, I suppose. Does that kind of answer your question?
There's one here and then one there. So have I missed anyone?
Hello, my question is about acquisitions and donations. I heard on the news a while ago that Margaret Thatcher's family offered her clothes and some personal belongings to the Victorian Albert Museum. And I thought, great, I'll go and have a look when they're on display. They said, no thanks. Now I'm just wondering why. I mean, English female prime ministers aren't that plentiful. So I was just wondering, like, what criteria they used. I mean, I'm sure they made quite a lot at auction.
Well, I'm happy to try and answer that because I was really. I think the difficulty there was that first of all we don't have a National Museum of England, and we don't really have a National Museum of the UK. Although we have the British Museum, it doesn't show the UK. It shows bits of the UK. So we don't actually have a museum that has a collecting policy that says we're going to collect national history. That's the problem. They offered it, therefore, to the V&A. Now, the V&A is very different from a history museum. It's about style and about industrial design. And they felt that her clothes weren't stylish or interesting enough. So they rejected them because they had a collecting policy which said that they only collected the most interesting and best examples of certain types of style. Unfortunately, Mrs. Thatcher had what has been said in a very derogatory way, but I think it's probably, that I'm not saying it in a derogatory way. She had a very middle class style. She wasn't haute couture. She was just dressed as a woman who tried to be smart and looked like she was a prime minister. Now, I would agree with what I think you were saying, which is I think a museum somewhere should have taken those collections in, because that we don't actually have many female prime ministers, and her clothes were part of her national political style, including her handbags. But and it's an interesting issue which we don't have time to discuss today, but we do not have a National Museum of the UK, and we don't have a National Museum of England. We have one in Northern Ireland, we have one in Ireland, not UK obviously, we have one in Scotland, we have one in Wales, we have several in Wales and several in Scotland. We don't have anything like that in England. So that was very interesting, and it sort of showed this big rent in the museum fabric, really. So I don't know, there's another person at the back who would like to contribute. So we're running out of time, so I'm going to gallop up the back.
This notion of diaspora and citizenship, because through working through the library here over the last 16 years, I have developed contacts with our new Irish communities who've taken Irish citizenship, and they've migrated to Ireland under the auspices of the Celtic Tiger, and they've become settled Irish new citizens. But they had to migrate during the crash, so we have a new diaspora. And I'm just wondering, are there examples of case studies or even examples in essays or papers of this new global diaspora? Because I think the diaspora that we've referred to in this conversation tend to be white Irish, the 70 million. And there are new Irish diaspora who are not, that they don't fit into that category. More comment.
And a very interesting comment as well. And I think that's typical of the questions and complexities that are being raised now in a world that moves very fast, and people come, take on a nationality, move somewhere else. And yes, there have been lots of intermarriages, and I mean, to come back to hybridity, I mean, that's a whole issue about which we haven't really discussed, which is a shame. And I don't know if anybody on the panel has any comments on this, but I think it's a really interesting issue where so many people will have a range of different types of belongings to different things. And one of the things I think has been very interesting is, and I've been as guilty of this as anyone, is that we tend to talk about identity and belonging as something that is still quite essentialised. Whereas I don't know about you, but I always feel very different about my identity wherever I am. So now I'm in Ireland, I feel terribly English. But when I'm in England, I don't feel English at all. That's a bit odd. But because I'm sort of at home and I don't really think about it. And I go to the States and I feel English in a very different way. And so one of the things I think is complex, which museums maybe we have to think about, is the fact that actually all peoples have this very complex set of feelings about who they are and where they belong, and it's very contextualized about who they're with, where they are, even what somebody's just said to them. And I think to go back to something that was said earlier, it is about good design. It's about allowing open questions. It's about encouraging people to think, and maybe having conversations with other people, and opening up museums to that sense that instead of being places where you go and look at things, you go and talk about things, which I think will make a difference.
Can I just make one observation about the general discussion today, which is, it's another instance of culturalized discourse, which the American critic Ben Michael has attacked. The trouble with diversity is that when we continuously talk about nothing only culture and only identity, we include questions of class, poverty, and equality. And this is the ethical question, I think, which is lying underneath everything we've been discussing today. And we've just been talking about diversity as a product of globalization. But globalization itself is an expression of neoliberal economics, the massive flows of people in the world today. And if I may, because it's so profound and so relevant to what we're talking about, the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, in his strikingly titled book, Does Ethics Have a Chance in a World of Consumers? He said, all varieties of liquid modern society are increasingly reconciled to the permanence of economic and social inequality. The vision of uniform, universally shared life conditions is being replaced by that of principally unlimited diversification. And the right to become equal is being replaced by the right to be and remain different without being denied dignity and respect for that, for the same reason. Our problem with the museum is that it's a product of the Enlightenment. It kind of came through in, I think, Elizabeth's talk this morning as well. We expect the museum to be a good place, a forum for forging consensus, enlightenment, well-being. The thing is, when we try to confront questions of identity, we potentially stand the chance that we contradict or undermine those very, it's what you might call a tragic condition, that with the best intent we can undermine those very goals and values. But part of the reason I think that we will do it complacently and wrongly and unethically is if the question of class and differences in wealth. Because let's face it, a lot of the migrants, and I think it was implicit there in Jenny's question as well, a lot of the people who are coming here, they're not rich people. They're working sometimes in the most menial jobs in society and in some with some of the lowest wages as well. So that's part of the picture that we really need to put back in.
Yes, and I think I agree, and I don't know if the panel has anything to say, but I was thinking very much like when we were talking about the role that art can play, and I agree, in opening up concepts and ideas. I think there are some people for whom their educational background will make it quite difficult for them to engage in the way in which we are acclimatized and culturally accustomed to deal with. When I used to work as an education officer within a museum, I used to spend time with people who were disadvantaged in various ways, and part of my role was to try and help them understand and give them the tools to understand some of the concepts that the museum assumed everybody had. So I agree with you entirely. I think there's sort of this whole set of things here that would be really useful for us to take away, and that is that this has been, and I'm going to have to wind this up now, this has been a really great discussion. I hope it's given you lots of things to think about, but in many ways we have only just touched on some of the key issues that we should be thinking about when we're working and visiting museums. But I'd like to thank everybody here. I'd like to thank Fionnuala for hosting it, and all the people behind the scenes, as she said. I'd like to thank all the panel for coming and giving such fabulous presentations. I learned a great deal today, and I'd like to thank all of you, and I'm going to hand over to Fionnuala to wrap up.
Okay.
Oh, three, all at once. Well, look, I echo, thank you, Sheila, for as you say, you got the tough spot. Everyone is flagging towards the end of the day. But I want to thank all our speakers, starting with James Kuno, who's had to leave us, but Pat and Peter Aronsson and Sheila and Reinald, thank you for joining the panel. and Elizabeth and Alan for coming from so far to join us today. But thank you also for being here and for sticking it out for the whole day. I mean, we have of course only started to scratch the subjects, because there's so much to be said before you can actually start talking about it. So much contextualizing to do, and I hope we've just done something today. We've got the conversations going, and we'll try and do something more again to keep it going. I just wanted to say to you that we are hoping to edit and publish the proceedings of the papers of today, and also Jim Cuno's talk last night. That'll happen later in the year, but as you see, Graham has been filming today, and he's going to edit and get that ready for us, and we will upload it, and the same will happen with James Cuno's lecture last night. So a lot of people were asking about that, so we'll be able to let everybody know when they're available. So thank you so much for your active participation, and again thank you to my colleagues here who've kept the day going behind the scenes. Thanks.